not my mother. So, this story happened about 11 years ago. I was a senior in high school at the time, but it is the single most mind-boggling thing that I have ever experienced. It is also important to note that it happened in mid-December. I am from Iowa, and the winters here get cold at night. Like if you get stuck outside, you will die kind of cold. That, plus the snowfall makes everything dead silent. You can hear anything and everything inside of the house, and even immediately outside of it. Well, me and my best friend were hanging out in my family's walkout basement, just having a boring winter night, playing video games. We were also the only ones home. The reason it was just us is because my mother went from work straight to a bar to grab a few drinks with coworkers. So me and my friend thought it would be a good idea to break into the family wine and live a little. As we were sitting there opening up the first bottle, I hear the door to the garage open and slam shut. I immediately go, "Oh shit," and start looking for places to hide the bottle. My friend then says, "I thought you said your mom was supposed to be out all night." "She was," I replied. I then heard a few very heavy stomps and hear my mother yell out, "Anyone home?" I yell back up the stairs. "Yup, just hanging out in the basement." I hear a few more steps move from the garage door towards the stairs, and she yells out again, "Can you come help me with something? I need you up here." I reply back, while frantically trying to find a good place to hide the wine bottle. "Yup, give me just a minute." Then there was silence for about 20 seconds. "Anyone down there with you?" She yelled back, in a more concerned, serious tone, in a voice that was slightly off from my mother's. This was the first thing that told me something wasn't right. Our family never cared if anyone was over, as our house was a very open house to all family and friends. And the voice? It was just wrong. Like it sounded like my mother's, but it was missing something that I couldn't put my finger on. Weirded out, I replied back, "Just Colton." After I yelled back to her, I found a good place to hide the bottle and began walking up the steps to the next level. Now, as I was walking up the steps, I couldn't help but feel the overbearing silence of the house and the slight electric twinge that something isn't right. When I got to the top of the steps, I look over to where the door of the garage is, and also to the kitchen right next to it, and it's black. Pitch black. All of the lights were off, and there was no moonlight shining through any windows. I walked over to the kitchen yelling out, "Mom, where are you?" There was no reply, just silence and darkness. I feel the electric twinge turn into full needles, and my adrenaline kicking in full force. I have to get out of here as fast as possible. My mother was not home. I run back downstairs, grabbing my coat along the way. "What's wrong?" Colton says. "My mom's not home," I reply as fast as I can, looking for my truck keys. "What do you mean? You were just talking with her." I see the confusion in his face. "There's no one home. We need to leave now." I took a few steps towards the back door that opens up to the yard, and then I see my dog shaking on the couch and my cat growling behind it. I couldn't leave them. I just knew that if we left, something would happen. "Are we leaving?" Colton said, still confused as hell. "No, I can't leave them here alone. Something is really off. I'm going to call my mom and figure this out." I pull out my phone and call my mom. She picks up immediately. "What's going on?" She answers. "Mom, were you just home? I heard you yelling from the second level, and when I went up, you weren't there," I said frantically, hoping that she was playing a joke. "No, I'm just leaving the bar. I wasn't feeling very well. Are you okay? What do you mean you heard me?" I fill her in on the whole story, and she rushes home. Colton and I stayed in the basement with the animals until she got home. But before she did, you could hear something upstairs. Not walking or sitting on things, but a pressure in the air, like a black hole was slowly moving from one room to the next. And the word that I would instinctively describe it as is hungry. When she got home, you could feel the thing just leave as quickly as it came, like an overbearing predatory presence had just flown away. We still have never figured out what the hell was going on, and this is just one story of many unexplainable things that have happened to us. But this is the easiest to write down, and one that I was happy to have a witness. My mother has passed away now, and I have moved away to Arizona, but whenever I go back to Iowa, and I see Colton, he still gets creeped out by what happened. I will never truly know what happened, but I know that whatever it was that had my mother's voice, it was evil, and it was hungry. both the forest and the trees. Note to Jerry: since the bank foreclosed on the property 6 months after the prior owner went MIA, I think we're exempt from the usual requirements to hold any remaining possessions in storage for 6 months. Might want to run that one by Jim though, just in case. At any rate, there wasn't much left. Just this letter, a pen and pencil, and a couple of changes of clothes. Thanks. B. There's something wrong with the forest behind my house. I got to get this story down as quickly as possible. I'm not sure how many more times it will let me come back. If you don't take anything else from this, then please, for the sake of yourself and everyone who cares about you, don't get anywhere near the woods. Never trust a realtor who's telling you she's giving you the deal of a lifetime. It's a cute Cape Cod, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, with cream-colored siding and forest green shutters. It was priced 30 grand below where it should have been, and I was a fool not to suspect something. The realtor was talking a little too fast, probably eager to get the hell out of this accursed plot of land, I realize now. The best feature of the house, she kept stressing, was that the backyard had access to this marvelous tract of wild woodland, which the state had indicated that it would neither sell nor develop. What a wonderful treat for your children when they come, in time, she promised. My fingers clenched and unclenched. I couldn't wait to get my hands on those keys. Toto and I took a walk in the woods during our first afternoon in the house. It was gorgeous. Acres of maple, oak, birch, pine, and spruce, with vivacious streams gurgling their way through the gentle hills, and outcroppings of huge rocks, like giants building blocks here and there. There weren't any paths, but somehow, I always knew where to go. From the first time I entered those woods, I would walk until I found my way to a clearing surrounded by a circle of birch, which resembled bleached finger bones reaching up out of the lush shamrock green grass that flourished beneath them. Their white papery bark was covered in Morse code dots and dashes, as though they carried some eldritch message from deep in the earth to the sky and the stars beyond. Toto stuck to the backyard for the first week or so, but after that, he got more adventurous. I didn't worry. He'd been with me for 7 years, and he was a cautious and self-sufficient little guy. During the second week that the two of us were in the house, however, I noticed that he started staying out for longer. An hour, then 75 minutes, then an hour and a half. During the third week, I decided to keep him mostly inside for a couple hours each day. I attached his leash to a wire runner that I hooked up to the clothesline so that he could still get some exercise. I noticed great gashes where Toto had strained against this setup, digging to free himself so that he could run into the woods. Finally, Toto slipped out one afternoon while I was returning home with my arms full of groceries. Though, I spent the next 6 hours wandering around the forest calling for him, and at one point, I swore I heard Toto barking back, but I never saw him again. Day after day, I sat down in my circular clearing, sobbing hysterically as the time slipped away. My sister knew that I was heartbroken, so she sent my 7-year-old niece, Elizabeth, to visit. That girl was a ray of sunshine as bright as her golden blonde hair. The two of us made cookies, watched movies, and played hide and seek until we knew each other's strategies so well that the game didn't work any longer. On the third day of her visit, after relentless prodding, I agreed to take Elizabeth out into the woods with me. Only a short walk, I told her as we headed out through the backyard. Check out that cloud. It looks like a hippopotamus, Eliza noted as we sat in the circular clearing and studied the cotton candy cumulus clouds floating by. That one looks like Gandalf, Elizabeth squealed, pointing to a face in the crook of an oak. This is a special place, she proclaimed a minute later, as the two of us sprawled side by side on our bed of grass, which was so comfortable that I had begun to drift off to sleep. On our way back, Elizabeth stopped and pointed to a tree. It was a large one, over 50 feet tall, and it was stooped and moss-covered, with countless forks and broken branches. That one looks like Toto, Elizabeth exclaimed. I followed her finger and caught my breath. There, in a fork about 10 feet up, there was the unmistakable outline of 4 legs, a head, and a tiny tail sprouting out from behind. It was eerie, so detailed that I could have identified it as a terrier. And I knew it couldn't be true, but I swear, there was a notch taken out of the right ear, just where Toto had lost a bit of flesh to an angry cat in our old neighborhood. The dog's mouth was open, ready to issue a yap. Unsettled, I took Elizabeth's hand and led her away. 2 days later, I received a call from my sister. Elizabeth's gone, Sharon wailed. Gone! I had to have her repeat the story 3 times before she was speaking clearly enough for me to understand it. Apparently, Elizabeth had left behind a drawing of some trees with a note that said, "Gone to my special place." Late at night, after my sister was asleep, Elizabeth had snuck out through the back door. It had been 16 hours, and the state trooper still didn't have a lead. "My God, Sharon," I sobbed. "I don't know what to say." I couldn't tell her about the forest. I decided it would sound too crazy. Besides, my sister lived 45 minutes away. I went for a walk out back again. That day, I stayed out for longer than usual. I made my way to my clearing, Elizabeth's special place, and then wandered around, exploring the forest in dizzying concentric circles until my stomach rumbled and my ankles blistered when I finally found it. I was so startled that it nearly knocked me over. There was a hole in an ancient fir at about head height, Elizabeth's gaping, anguished mouth, and above it 2 smaller blemishes that were her eyes, which bulged out as if trying to escape her rictus of horror. Around her head, rings of curls cascaded down to where her shoulders should have been. Her cute snubbed nose and a mark on her forehead where she had run into a coffee table were both there, rendered in moss, and bark, and leaf. At the local library, I found a book on the early history of this section of the Northeast. It was crowded with handwritten notes about the section of woodland behind my house. Seams bounded at X degrees latitude and X degrees longitude. Power wanes exponentially outside of that zone. Local Native Americans considered this stretch of the woods both holy and a place where they communed with ancestors, and profane. Their oral tradition mentions Lukhamanga, the trapped ones, but none of the elders who I asked about were willing to speak on the subject. There was a professor of anthropology from the state college who was real interested in that book a while back, the librarian informed me from over my shoulder. "Do you remember his name?" I asked. She shook her head. "He disappeared. Never got the last set of books that he checked out back from him either." She shook her head and muttered angrily as she walked away. I checked the county records for the property that I had bought. It had switched hands about 10 times as often as any of the adjacent tracts, and the number of deaths and disappearances around it boggled my mind. My foray into the woods grew longer. I started to wander into the forest without intending to. Usually at night, I would wake up in the middle of the clearing, the birches looming out of the midnight mist like doomsday prophecies. I wouldn't remember how I had gotten there, and installing a new doorknob so that I wouldn't lock my bedroom door from the inside did no good. I would simply unlock the door during my sleepwalking. After a couple of weeks, I noticed a strange grayish rash appearing on my forearms. Ichthyosis, my primary care doctor confirmed, as she explained that it could be inherited or caused by certain conditions, such as Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's named after the iguana-like appearance that it gives to skin in cases such as yours. To her, it might have looked like reptile skin, but I knew what it was. Bark, gray, and cracked, and spreading. I stayed at my sister's for a couple of nights. I refused to fall asleep for the first 24 hours, almost collapsing with relief after I realized that I had spent a night away from those woods. On the second night, however, I accepted my sister's offer of an Ambien. When I woke up, I was in the clearing. As I stood in the middle and studied each tree in turn, I realized that each of them bore at least one face, some old and wizened, some young and fresh. All of them had gaping mouths forming O's as they struggled to speak or scream. When I closed my eyes, I swore that I could hear them moan and whisper, "Let us out." I thought I heard, "Now, go, no, help, help." I came back and jotted this message down, fully aware that each word could be my last. I can feel the forest inside of me, its inexorable will, its strange gravity. Strangely enough, I know which tree will become me, and I think that it has already started to alter itself, to accommodate me. My arms and legs are covered in the rash, which has spread to my chest and the bridge of my nose. I'm sure that it will take me soon. Now, heed my warning, or pay the price. My son keeps counting down. Now, I know what happens at 0. The bullying started when Noah was 5. He was only small for his age, speckled and freckled with a shock of copper hair. He was an easy target. I kept telling him to hit back, to stand his ground, That's what I had done when I was little. But Noah wasn't me. He was gentle and kind. I have to keep reminding myself that. He liked to read and loved to watch Star Trek with me. He was a good kid. It was just a shame no one else could see it. His mom died when he was 8, leaving me as his sole parent. I tried my best, still do, but I'm not his mother. I'm not as gentle or kind, and my smiles don't lighten up a room. It's hard doing it all alone. He misses her, missed her. She left a hole, and no one else can fill it. He came home from school one day and told me he made a friend, Martin. I was happy for him. I thought it would be good for him, and that it would bring him out of his shell. I assumed it was some other kid whose peers deemed him as weird, and that they could take comfort in their exile with each other. He'd go to Martin's after school, and come back smiling and happy. I was so relieved. Then, one day, Noah didn't come home. I waited half an hour, in the hopes that he was just late, and that he'd lost track of time. When he didn't show, I started to get worried. I began wandering the streets looking for him. I knocked half the doors in the neighborhood before I finally called the police. They were worried too, especially when I told them Noah wasn't the sort of kid to stay out all night. He was missing for a total of 2 days. I can't tell you the terror I lived through. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I wandered the streets shouting his name. All the bullies from his class finally found their conscience and helped by posting flyers about the town. Their parents came round with plates of food and offers to help. It was a tragedy to make people see you to make them help. Martin never came. You see, when the police went to the school to find out Martin's address, they found that there was no Martin in Noah's class. There were only 2 Martins in my very small town, in fact. One was a local S offender, and the other was an elderly man at Pinewood Avenue who was bedbound. It goes without saying that I feared the worst. Then, they found him. When I got the call, I thought I'd be driving to a mortuary, but they sent me instead to the hospital. I got a speeding ticket trying to get there as quickly as I could. My head was buzzing. What had happened to him? Was he all right? My little Noah. When I arrived, the policeman ambushed me. He took me into a relative's room. His face was grave, and I could have wept standing there, waiting. "We found him in Magnolia," he said. "He's completely uninjured. There's no sign of any assault, but he's..." Why does there always have to be a but? Why couldn't he have been fine? Why couldn't he have wanted to come home and watch Star Trek with me? My relief died like fire in the rain. He's not responding well. We found him in an abandoned house. He was sitting alone in a room. He had been fed and watered. From all evidence of the scene, there appears to be no sign of restraint nor any kidnap. We're still investigating, but Noah isn't exactly forthcoming with any information. The doctors are hopeful that your presence might change that. He was in a bed, cross-legged, and staring at the ceiling. He didn't even look at me as I entered. Something was wrong. 100,003, he said in his feeble little voice. Sunlight crept in through the blinds and blanketed him in strange bars. 100,002? Noah? It's Dad. I called out to him. My words didn't seem to reach him. He was in his own world, just counting. 100,001? 100,000, he said. 99,999? Mr. McMahon? A doctor said. He was old and gray. His face was as grave as the policeman's. I'm Dr. Auld. I'm a child psychiatrist in charge of your son's care. I have a few questions for you. Firstly, I want to promise you that we're doing all we can to help Noah. Why isn't he speaking? Why is he counting? I asked. Does your son have autism or any mental conditions? Is there a history of schizophrenia in your family or his mother's side? He asked, providing me with no information. No autism, no schizophrenia. He's got nothing like that. Why is he like this? What's going on? Please, Doc. I glanced at him again, still counting away. I looked at my son, Noah. He's eating and drinking. He has no injuries nor any fever. My initial guess was early presenting schizophrenia. Yet without any family history and his lack of reaction to medication, I find it unlikely, Dr. Auld said. To be quite honest, Mr. McMahon, I'm at a loss. I have called in a colleague of mine from another hospital for a second opinion. I was hopeful he might have reacted to you. While I can't rule out any physical assault, I cannot dismiss the possibility of some sort of trauma that has caused Noah's change in behavior. That sicko had hurt him in some way. He might not have laid a hand on him, but he had put something in Noah's head. I became sure of it then. Martin. His friend hadn't been some kid from class, but the neighborhood creep who had taken advantage of his loneliness. It wasn't easy leaving Noah in the hospital, but I was too angry to be of any real use to him there. A few of the dads from Noah's class told me where the creep lived. They offered to come along and help, but I didn't want to get them in trouble. This was my burden to bear. I had been such an awful father. I should have known who my son was hanging out with after school. I should have. Mindy would have. He lived in a rundown apartment complex. Graffiti had been scrubbed off of the walls, leaving only a thin smear of red and blue. I didn't knock. I plunged his door open. The disgusting lout was sprawled out on his couch, with a roll-up between his thin, dried-up lips. Before he could even react, my fist went burrowing down into his face. The sound of his grimacing filled me with perverse pleasure. He looked confused and tried to scramble away. "What the? Who are you?" the slimebag said. "Noah's father. What did you do to him?" I punched again and heard his nose breaking. "The 10-year-old boy. I ain't seen any 10-year-olds. Jesus fuck," he exclaimed, his forearms across his face defensively. I stopped punching. "That missing kid? I told the cops already I ain't got nothing to do with that. I swear. I don't have anything to do with your kid. Believe me. Please." His coffee table was stacked high with adult magazines. I believed him. I called the police on myself in the end. They were extremely sympathetic, and Martin agreed not to press any charges, though I am pretty sure the sack of cannabis on the table they agreed to overlook in exchange played a part in that. Good guys, the cops in my town. I went back to the hospital. Nothing had changed. He was still counting down. Every hour the numbers grew smaller. He'd stop to sleep, but when he'd wake up he'd continue the count. 40,603, he said. His voice was changing. The doc said it had to do with the fact that he never shut up anymore. His vocal cords were strained and raw. He almost sounded like an old man. My poor little Noah. I couldn't help but wonder what would happen when he got down to 0. Would he stop counting? What would happen when he was finished? I think the doctors were wondering that too. They were stumped. Never seen a case like Noah before, they kept saying. Why did it have to be my kid? He'd been through enough. Mindy. The bullying? Why him? I'm sorry, son, I said to him. He didn't look at me. I grabbed his hand, which he pulled back. He used to let me hold him when he was sad. He'd come in from school with his bag slumped across his shoulders, and I'd just hold him as he cried. Not anymore. Noah wasn't in there, and if he was buried deep. I grabbed his hand again. I had Mindy's favorite necklace in my pocket, and I slipped it around his neck. Help me. I looked to the sky and hoped she was up there. Maybe you can reach him, I thought quietly. It's my one remaining comfort to imagine that she did. As the cold metal touched his neck, he squeezed my hand. In between mindless numbers, he looked at me. His eyes were wide with terror, like a pig at its slaughter. Dad, what's happening to me? He said. I thought I had him back, but the moment died as quickly as it came. The lights switched back off, and I was in the dark abyss again, searching the cold nothing for a thread of the sun I loved so much. 39,963. This isn't fair. Life. If God is real, he sure likes giving us more than we can handle. We were getting down to double digits. I was sitting at his bedside, and the doctors had gathered like a swarm. My tragedy was a show to them. They could go home and leave it behind. My head was in my hands. I was scared. I don't know why. Unease hung in the air like a cloud. Something wasn't right. I knew that. The son I loved fell further away with every strained number. He was drifting off into the heather, and all of my love would go with him. 20. 19. He said at short intervals. There was a jotting on clipboards and nurses that had paused. Wordless. I felt like something was going to happen. 18. 17. I thought about when he was a baby. So tiny I could hold him with one hand. I thought of that first word. So pure and innocent. Da. I thought about leaving him at school for the first time in his little uniform. with the blue blazer, and tears when he came home with mud on his knees from being pushed over. I thought about Mindy, and how they'd snuggle up together in bed watching some kids' films. All those fragile moments crowded my head, and for a few seconds, I was warm from the love of them. All the while, the numbers grew smaller. 5, 4, 3, 2. There was a pause before it came. The doctors held their breath. Somewhere behind me, a nurse dropped her pen, and it fell to the ground slowly, as if gravity didn't work anymore. It rolled around on the floor like a spinning hat, with no momentum. 1. He started convulsing. His eyes rolled to the back of his head, just little pools of white. His little body, every inch of it I adored and loved, trashed around as if electricity was coursing through it. The nurses and doctors pushed me out of the way. All I could do was watch as my world crumbled into nothing. Then he stopped. There was a moment of calm. He slowly pushed his way out of the nurse's grip, and he sat up. I felt hope reach a crescendo within me. He's back, I thought. He's home. And I looked at him and it slipped away again, into a void of spreading dread. His eyes weren't his anymore. They were the same blue, but they belonged to a stranger. "Where am I?" he asked in that strange crackled voice. A parent knows. I can't explain it. You just know. The Noah sat on that hospital bed wasn't my Noah. He was someone else's. He looked at me as if he didn't know me. All the moisture had been drained out of me. I felt nothing, like I would dissolve into tatters. "You're in the hospital, Noah," Dr. Auld said. "Good," he said. He grunted, and his body moved oddly. He surveyed his hands and legs as if he were just discovering them, and moved as if he expected them to ache. "I feel good." That's excellent," a nurse said, with a warm smile. "Do you want some of your toys? Your dad brought you in your favorite stuffed bear." He looked at Mr. Snuffles as if he had never seen him before. My hairs were standing up. They refused to lie flat. "Interesting bear," he said, judging his missing eye. He spoke as if he was older, more seasoned. This wasn't Noah. He did not cradle it to his chest. It looked at me, that thing in my son's body, and a small smile touched its lips, creeping up at the corners unnaturally. I shook my head. This couldn't be. "His vitals are stable," Dr. Auld told me. "This is good." "He isn't talking like Noah," I said to him. He mused with his clipboard. "He isn't acting like Noah." Whatever has happened to him has clearly had a great effect. It may take time for him to return to normal, if at all, he said. "It's still Noah. He's speaking now. That means we can help." I took no reassurance from his words. Hours passed like days. Noah moved as if he had never had a body before, or at least a working one. He marveled at every joint and birthmark. He kept stretching his arms out just to study the way they moved, and he didn't speak much. "When we get home, we can watch Star Trek all weekend. I'm off for a few weeks," I said to him, hoping to draw my son out of whatever shell he was in. "I'd prefer MASH," he said, and I flinched. "I can't wait to get home and have some kippers." Kippers and MASH? Somewhere else in the hospital, another tragedy was underway. I was wandering the halls numbly with a cup of hot coffee in my hands. The doors to the ambulatory slammed open. A trolley was rushed through, a crowd of frantic family members chasing after it. An old man lay in a bed, reaching out for this guy's embrace. He was panicked. His eyes were wide like Noah's had been when he called out for me. "I want my dad! I want my dad!" The old man shouted at the top of his lungs. A young woman was holding on to the side of his trolley, his daughter maybe, yet the man did not seem to know her. Every time her hands came down to comfort him, he flinched. Then he saw me, and his hand pulled out for me. His words seemed to have been stolen from him. He was trying to throw himself out of the trolley just to reach me. "Dad! I want my dad!" he shouted, and the words filled my belly with dull throbbing unease. "Does your father have dementia?" the doctor was asking the woman. No. He's just not able to get around much anymore. That's all. He's never been like this. He's been a little down lately about not being able to get out as much, but he's always been sane," she said. Her voice etched with pain, a pain I knew too well. Her situation was not so dissimilar to mine. A relative, not acting like themselves. The same, but different. "Dad, it's me." "No, Dad." I want my dad! My mom! Dad! He cried, reaching out for me again. My body wanted to chase after him, to reach him. The coffee cup slipped down from my hand and fell like a clatter to the ground. A pool of dark brown soaked my feet. Do you have a name so we can pull his records? The doctor asked as he followed the trolley into the room. The old man slipped out of view. Martin. The woman, still breathless, replied. His name is Martin Smith. A strange coincidence. Had to be. Little lines tied together, stitching into some awful patchwork quilt. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be. I returned to Noah. I felt like a zombie, like my head wasn't connected anymore. It was floating in the clouds. Nothing made sense. I can't wait to go home with you, Dad, Noah said, and my eyebrows furrowed. I shut my eyes and thought of my boy at the gates of the school, in the arms of his mother. His face turned wrinkled and old. We're going to have so much fun. I just know it. He's not my kid. This thing I'm taking home, it's not my kid. Something's out here with us. Last weekend, one of my friends brought up the idea of camping. At first, I was opposed to it, as it's fall and cold outside, and the idea of having to sleep in a tent with another person just didn't seem appealing. But when all 5 of us talked about it, I realized that maybe it wasn't such a bad idea after all. We decided to do it next weekend, aka now. This morning we went out and bought everything we needed. Tents, snakes, a lighter, and a couple of things that don't need mentioning. We decided it would be best to do it in the woods 2 hours away from any road or houses. I was particularly upset about that, as anything could happen from some random person attacking us to a bear sneaking in our tents. But we'd have our car parked on the nearest road, so if anything did happen, we could just run to it. At least that's what some others said. I brought up the fact that it's a 2-hour walk, but of course I was ignored. We drove as far as we could before we got out to start walking. I noticed a few things. First of all, no sound of wildlife. No crickets, no birds, no nothing making sound. And it felt odd, like something was slightly off. I chalked it up to my nerves acting up and ignored it. Where should we set the tents up? Rob asked, taking a puff of his joint. Right over there looks good, Nate replied, motioning for Rob to pass it to him. Who's setting it up? After a little conversation, we decided Dan and Murphy could do it, while the rest of us go out to see if we can find any squirrels to hunt. I doubted it. It didn't exactly seem like the place was crawling with wildlife. Grab my rifle, would ya? I grabbed it and threw it at him. Don't worry, it wasn't loaded yet. He catches it saying a quick thanks, and off we went. We were out for hours looking to no avail. There was absolutely nothing. I didn't even see any bugs. Maybe we should go back now. We can eat the stuff we brought, I suggested. Rob and Nate stopped walking, to which I assumed meant they agreed. We turned back around and started walking back towards the camp. After a couple of minutes of walking, I heard a sound. It was quiet, but we all heard it. We stopped walking to look around. Behind us there was a deer, except it wasn't normal. Its horns were growing out of its mouth, and it had 5 legs. I had never seen anything like it before, but I've heard of it. Deformed deers? I wasn't too worried. We decided not to kill it because we definitely weren't about to eat it, being too worried about catching some type of disease. I wondered though, how long had that deer been following us? Being so silent that we hadn't even noticed it. We made it back to the camp about an hour later. We ended up eating some cans of chili we brought with us. We cooked them over the fire we made. The 5 of us were sharing tents, 2 in one and 3 in the other. I was sharing with Nate. Robert, Murphy, and Dan were in the other. And we stayed up for a few more hours singing songs and drinking beer before heading off to bed. I fell asleep about an hour after laying down. I woke up to a clicking noise. It took me a second to register what was happening. I assumed it was one of the guys doing something, but just in case, I grabbed my gun and unzipped the tent. I froze. The deer from before was standing outside of my tent, its mouth moving weirdly, and its teeth were clicking against each other every few seconds from the weird movement. It followed us all the way back? How did we not notice? I zipped the tent back and tried to ignore it. Needless to say, I got no sleep that night. The next morning, all 6 of us decided to stay one more night before packing up to leave. It was weird. I felt like something was messing with my mind, that my brain wasn't working correctly. I was scared. I just didn't know what of. Me, Dan, Nate, Robert, Murphy, and... Wait, and? What was I talking about? There was only 5. No, 6 of us. Wait, 6? Never mind. It's not important. I spent all evening wondering what was wrong with my mind, and I could tell the others felt the same way. That night, all 6 of us went to sleep. 3 in one, and 3 in another. I was with Nate and... someone. Something felt wrong, but I just couldn't put my foot on it. That night I woke up to the same clicking noise as last night, but this time, from inside the tent. I was too scared to move. Had the deer somehow made it into the tent? However, I felt Nate shift to get up. What? I heard him say before he went silent, cutting off whatever he was about to say. What the hell? I heard him say again, slightly louder this time. I felt something move on my left side, which was strange because Nate was on my right side. Oh shit! I heard before I felt someone leap over me onto Nate. I woke up the next morning panting. Was it all a dream? I wondered. All 5 of us packed up to leave, but something still felt wrong. No. One of us felt wrong. Nate was off. He talked the same and acted the same, but it was the way he looked. Have you ever heard of Uncanny Valley? Like that. I know something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I ignored it. And with that, all 5 of us walked to the car, got in, and took off. I couldn't help but feel like I made a mistake, like I was about to unleash something unholy into the town we live in, like I did something bad. If you made it this far, leave a like, and as always, thanks for watching.